Hi, this is Dr. Joe Green, head pastor of Antioch Assembly Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. As we get closer to this election cycle, and next Tuesday, which is let me see, this coming Tuesday is November the 6th, you'll have what's known as the midterm elections, and so there's a frantic race to get votes from both the Democrats, the Republicans, the liberals, the conservatives, the Trumpers, MAGAs, Make America Great Again, and the Never Trumpers. And so there's like a frantic fight to gain power. So Trump right now has the power. He is the president. He has the majority in the Congress. And so those who oppose him are very much in panic mode, if you will, especially with this last Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh that just got confirmed, which of course gives a lot of it's a victory for pro-life people and the globalists who are pro-abortion because it's part of their strategy for many people don't realize this, but the abortion is part of the strategy for population control, but also, and there's many Satanists and ex-Satanists that will tell you that abortion goes back to the ancient practices of sacrificing infants to Baal. And many of the ancient civilizations that actually worship Baal, which is just another name for a demonic entity, they used to sacrifice infants to Baal, and so, or Molech, or some of the other names of these evil principalities. So Satanists will tell you that that's part of their sacrifice. The unborn, the preborn children that's being murdered in the womb. So, and this is their talk, their words. So they acknowledge what we know spiritually to be the case. That abortion is something that we shouldn't do. It's murder. It's killing babies, and most people that participate in abortion don't really understand the depth of what it represents. Also, in the natural level, in a more surface level, the people that are globalists who are population controllers, eugenicists, which the word eugenics, as most of you probably know, means good genes or well born. And so the whole practice of eugenics is reducing certain populations in certain races and promoting birth rates in the more favored races, as they call it. Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. Charles Darwin created the theory of evolution through natural selection, and the rate, which is also subtitled as the race to preserve the favored races in the quest for life. Hitler was a eugenicist, and so the same people that funded the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany also funded the precursor for Planned Parenthood through Margaret Sanger. So these things are all normal, you know, and there's such a spiritual weight to these issues, which is why the average person has been manipulated into following after the Republican Democratic paradigm, you know, the left versus right, liberal versus conservative paradigm. But at the end of the day, it's the globalists that are pulling the strings, and these globalists are Luciferian because they said that they are. You know, and so we get taken advantage of because, and I'll say this over and over again, you hear me say this in most of my videos and most of my talks, we get taken advantage of because we don't really understand the enemy's devices or his schemes. Because this whole white-black thing, the racism in America, that's just a distraction for the real issues that are taking place. And as a matter of fact, if you get a chance to get the book, The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, they talk about how they want to constantly keep, they call them the Goyim, they constantly want to keep the Goyim, which is what we are called the human cattle, fighting over different divisions. So black versus white, women versus male, straight versus gay. These are the narratives that they push in order to get us fighting, which distracts us from our real enemy. And how they plan and how they think is they think they plan in centuries, and they plan in you know, long term, and their plan is a lot deeper. They're very patient in their plans, because what they do is all those people along the way that are endeavoring in what's known as the Great Work, which is building the New World Order, the One World Governmental System, Mystery Babylon, the Bible calls it, this great work, all those who help participate in it along the way actually get rewarded very, very well. And so many of them who started this probably didn't expect to see the culmination of this, but because they were a part of it, they were rewarded along the way. And so they plan multi-generationally. And most of us think more of surface and emotional, which is part of the social engineering. So the two main things that is happening right now as we go forward in this election cycle, two of the main things that strategies that's being used against the media is trauma-based mind control and the Hegelian dialectic. And I've talked about this several times. And there may be other names that other people call them by, but these are more of the formal names. Trauma-based mind control and the Hegelian dialectic. You know, the Bible tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love, power, and a sound mind. And the enemy understands the power in fear. And so when you talk about trauma-based mind control, it's rooted in fear. And once that fear is installed through the trauma, then it's easily accessible by the enemy using some things like the Hegelian dialectic is one of those, and I'll explain what that is, but also emotions. And what biologists will tell you is that your cells actually carry memory in it. And so because your cells carry memory, the trauma that you experience, if not properly dealt with, will actually go multi-generationally. You know, the Bible says that God will visit the iniquities of the fathers through 3 or 4 generations, but he visits the blessings of those through 1,000 generations who walk upright and who are obedient to him. But you got to realize that there is, scientists have discovered that there is actually memory in your cells, in your genes, and you pass on certain things to the next generation, which is why some people call them generational curses, some people call them familiar spirits. But think about this. That's why you can see traits in people that, of like a grandson may act like the grandfather, even though he may not have even known much about the grandfather. I'll give you an example. My father and my mother, they were together. My mother was young. She was about 20 years old. My father was 28. They got married. My mother had me, and my mother and my father separated soon after I was born. I was very young. And so for the most part, I didn't grow up around my biological father. But I recall from time to time, even as a teenager, now, of course, most of you know the story. I reconnected with him later in life. But, during my formative years, I didn't grow up around my father. And I remember from time to time my mother saying things to me like, you remind me of your dad when you do that, or when you say that, or your personality reminds me of him. Now, and I tell people that was completely genetics, that was completely biology, because I didn't grow up around him. I didn't even know him well enough to emulate any of his behaviors or characteristics. So that just goes to show you how there's memory in your cells. And again, this is not just something I'm just coming up with. It's been there's studies that have been done to prove it. But anyway, so the enemy knows that as well. And so the enemy uses that. He uses trauma-based mind control to socially engineer the masses, and he also uses what's known as the Hegelian dialectic. Now, the Hegelian dialectic is something that comes from Hegel, who was a philosopher from back in Europe in many years ago, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was during the Age of Enlightenment. But anyway, he was one of the philosophers that came. The philosophy that came from that time of what's called the Age of Enlightenment, and I'm going to share about that. Because again, you have to understand, in order to truly understand the strategy and the plan of the enemy, you can't go back 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. You have to go back centuries. And so what happens is there was this thing called from 1685 to 1815, Europe was what was known as the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment period. And during this time, European politics, philosophy, science, and communications were radically reoriented during this course. And what they did was it was occultic. They tapped into, Europe was in the Dark Ages, and then you had people from Europe. You had the Moors from Europe and different things. You had people that explored the ancient Egyptology. and all those other things in Europe. And so they brought the occult practices to Europe. And, like I said, the Mystery Babylon, the, those type of belief systems, they're age-old, ancient philosophies and practices, and they're all based on the occult. They're all based on Luciferianism. And so they began to study psychology and begin to understand the human brain. They also learned how to use various institutions like politics and philosophy and science and communications. So back then they had the press, of course, but now we have mainstream media. But I'm going to show you how it's the same philosophy. So they were able to get the best and the brightest of those particular areas, and they would form these think tanks, basically. And we know in 1776, you had Adam Weishaupt, who formalized their philosophy in what was called the Illuminati, the Order of the Illuminati. And the Order of the Illuminati was based on certain bloodline families, the Rothschilds being one of them. But also they identified the best and the brightest of these various institutions that I talked about. So like I talked about politics, philosophy, science, communication, business, and industry. And they brought them into these secret societies, and many of them were taught these occultic practices and how to manipulate and how to train the human mind. So again, when we're talking about the strategies that's being employed now, most people fall victim to these strategies because they're thinking about experientially. So they're talking about right now how they feel and what they experience. They may talk recent history. So some people go back to the civil rights movement or something along those lines as proof of what they believe. But if you're doing that, you're really thinking on a surface level, where you got to realize that the enemy and those who are these Luciferian New World Order people, they are tapping into age-old principalities, right? The Bible says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, the rulers of darkness of this age, right? Wickedness in high places, that's despotism. That's all governmental and institutional leaders and rulers of this world. And of course, Jesus referred to Satan as the god of this world. So this world and this world system is under that influence. So they think long term. So you're thinking about a strategy that goes all the way back to about 1685 and actually beyond that. But I'm saying the current influence that we see in the Western world goes back to about 1685 with the Age of Enlightenment. So what happened is you have 1776. They detain this courier, or there's a story saying that the courier that was carrying the documentation of the Order of the Illuminati, their plan or their conspiracy, if you will, the report is that he was struck by lightning. But in any event, they got his documentation and it was turned over to the authority, and they realized that there was a conspiracy, that this group was the secret society, this Order of Illuminati had strategized and planned to take over all of Europe and all of the world. They were trying to form a new world order. They called it the Great Work because they felt like they were going to create a utopian society in which they were the ruling class, and they would limit the population of the rest of the world, and they would and the ones that they would allow to be around, they were basically servants for this ruling elite class. And so in Europe, they were banned. They made it illegal in most of these European nations. If they found these people, they would throw them in jail, or they would ban, they would disperse them. So they had to change their strategy and go underground. So we just mentioned in 1776 with the Illuminati perfecting their strategy for the one world governmental system. Then you fast forwarded in the 1800s, you had Karl Marx, who comes from that same school of thought, and he came up with what is known as the Communist Manifesto. He was the forerunner of communism. And so what they did is they began to mask their strategy in other ways. And like I said, because they think long-term and multi-generational and multi-century, they're not in no hurry to do what they're going to do. They plan it, they strategize it, and they see it through to the end. So Karl Marx, he comes up with the Communist Manifesto, and what it was the Workers' Party, right? The workers of the world unite. But the only thing that the communism was, and they've said this in their documentation, they masked their true strategy or their true goal in a way that makes it seem as though they were trying to give power to the working class, to the workers. That's what the facade of communism is about. But ultimately what it was is to overthrow the oligarchs, the monarchs in Europe, and for them to replace them with their own power structure. And so you had Karl Marx, and then you had, of course, in Germany, the Nazis rise up in the late 1800s and early 1900s, this kind of philosophy. The Nazis gained power, Hitler and the Nazis in the early part of the 20th century, 1930s and 1940s. But anyway, these aren't new strategies. These were strategies that were being perfected. And if you understand Hitler and the Nazis, they used racism as a mask. But really, the Nazis were a cult. If you look at the Nazi swastika, a lot of people think that's a symbol of white supremacy or something. And again, it's because most people don't understand the deeper meanings to this. The Nazi swastika is not it's not a white supremacy, or the white supremacists have used it, and many people like that have used it. But it's ultimately an occult symbol, because what Hitler was about was the Aryan race. He thought the Aryan race was the descendants of the lost city of Atlantis, which were these Ubermen, these supermen, if you will. So these people were kind of like the Nephilim. They were half man, half gods, and he believed that there was a race of people like that, and Atlantis was the lost city. And so he was trying to revitalize that through what he called the Aryan race. And so it wasn't about white or black, because if you know Hitler actually destroyed mostly European people. He destroyed other Europeans, other people that we would call white. So it wasn't about that. It was about a specific classification of people. If you understand the Illuminati, it's not about white and black. It's not about white supremacy, which we falsely attach to their strategy. They use the white and black paradigm as a way to distract us so that they can implement their plan. But ultimately, it is this ruling elite class, the half of 1%ers, the half of 1% of people that actually are the ones who are trying to push this utopian paradise here on the earth. So they had these schools of thought. They began to come up with what was called think tanks as a way to mask their conspiracy, because they were found out, when their documentation got intercepted. So you had the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School was in Germany, early part of the 20th century. These think tanks of these various peoples, like I mentioned, politics, philosophy, education, science, communications, they all brought them together, and they began to strategize on how they were going to take over the world, basically. And of course, the Nazis used most of their strategies. So you had propaganda, which is when they used the media in order to promote their ideologies. And I'm gonna get back to this trauma-based thing, because what they use, the media is set up to traumatize the masses, to invoke fear and hatred and all these other things, but mainly fear. So in order to get Germany to go into world wars, they used the media and propaganda in order to promote war and to make the German people fear that they were going to get taken. After World War I, Germany was decimated. They lost the war big time. And so Hitler was able to kind of get people together using fear to say, in order for us to restore Germany to its greatness, we have to mobilize, and we're going to go back in and we're going to take over the world. That's how they got people together. And then after World War II, because the powers that be recognized what happened, when I say the powers that be, I mean the masses recognized it, which is why they split Germany up to East Germany and West Germany. So anyway, they began to use the Frankfurt School, and they start to practice what's called trauma-based programming, which is to invoke fear. Now, propaganda, this guy by the name of Edward Bernays, it's reported that he was a nephew of Adolf Hitler. You had the gentleman in Nazi, he was called the Minister of Propaganda, and they began to use tactics in order to use the media and use the press in order to, back then they just mainly had the printing press, but then in the early part of the 20th century, you had the movie industry that was created. So they used movies, then radio, and all these other things. They were all used as a way to begin to promote their ideology by invoking fear and other emotions in the people. If you guys remember Orson Welles here in America was very popular. He did this radio broadcast called The War of the Worlds, where he It's based on a book, of course, but it was about an invasion of aliens from another planet. I'm sorry. So the aliens came from another planet, and they did the radio broadcast, and the radio broadcast was so realistic. At first, they didn't even tell people that it was just a story. It was a hoax, basically. They made it seem as though it was real, and it caused such a public panic that they had to come back later and say, no, it's all just a made-up story, because people were literally in panic, in a massive hysteria over this. And they basically did it because Orson Welles and H.G. Wells and some of these other people are part of these think tanks known as the globalists or the Illuminati. And that was a way for them to confirm the power of the media. And so after World War II, the Nazis lost. America went in there, they captured these Nazi scientists, and they had this thing called Operation Mockingbird and Operation Paperclip first, that they brought these Nazi scientists here to America, many of them, and they actually took them to Columbia University, and they began to use what they learned through propaganda and the occult practices and the mind control and all that other stuff, and they began to perfect it, to use it for techniques to use on America, because they recognized that America was the biggest obstacle for them to push their one world order, new world order agenda. There was also another place called the Tavistock Institute, which is in England. Now, you got to realize that the Windsor family, which is the British royal family, they're actually cousins to the Germans and the Rothschild family. So there's a connection between Great Britain and Germany. And the Windsors had to change their name because they had the German last name. And after the Germans and the Nazis got discovered, they had to change their last name so that people didn't realize that they're actually descendants or relatives of the German aristocracy, of the German bloodline families as part of the Illuminati. And so then you had Tavistock Institute. They perfected the same things, the same type of think tanks that they began to use. Now with Operation Paperclip or Project Paperclip and Frankfurt and Tavistock, they start to gain all this data on how to manipulate the masses, because they're all in cahoots with each other. And then Tavistock and the Operation Paperclip, Project Paperclip, made way for what was known as the OSS, which was the forerunner for the CIA. So the CIA, the OSS, Tavistock, Frankfurt, the Nazis, all these people are all pretty much of the same thought processes, and it's all based on the occult. And if you don't know what the occult is, it's, witchcraft, it's demonology, it's a spiritual influence that's not a godly spiritual influence. So they use occult practices on how they would do these things. But one of the main things they did was trauma-based mind control and hypnosis. If you look, there's declassified documentation before anybody says, oh, he's just making something up. There's declassified government documentation where the CIA admitted not only about the MK Ultra programming that they used to study how to traumatize people. They use pharmaceuticals, so they use drugs and hallucinogens and all that other stuff to learn how to control and to manipulate people. Because pharmakia, or the spirit of pharmakia, is one of the things that the enemy uses, which is based on another name for drugs. Our modern pharmacies come from the word pharmakia, which is, in the Bible, it calls it witchcraft. It's a form of witchcraft. And so understanding all that they, like I said, look all this stuff up. MK Ultra. These are experiments that the CIA perfected, how to control people using trauma. You also can look at Operation Mockingbird. And Operation Mockingbird is when the CIA, with the Church Commission, they did a study and they found out that the CIA actually was in control of Hollywood and most of the media. And so they were using their what they learned, their research and all these techniques that they learned in order to manipulate and control the masses. And so even to this day, mainstream media, Hollywood, television, most of the entertainment industry behind the scenes is actually run by these people that are part of these think tanks, if you will. The Illuminati. They're either in the Illuminati or they're part of the organizations that are underneath the umbrella of the Illuminati. So you have the Council of Foreign Relations, you have the Bilderberg Group, you have Bohemian Grove, you have the Trilateral Commission, you have the the Club of Rome. You have a bunch of organizations that are actually underneath the umbrella of what's known as the Illuminati, and they're all people that are basically co-spiring, co-spiring with these groups of people, these ruling elite people, in order to promote their agenda, and in return they get influence, power, and wealth, and all the other things that come along with that. So a lot of times, if you go to like Bohemian Grove and some of these other things, they have these wild parties where all of your carnal desires are fulfilled. So whether it's women or boys or children or just crazy stuff they do, and all this is documented. There's people that have reported on this stuff. There's people that have been there and witnessed these type of things. There's a lady by the name of Fiona Barnett. If you get a chance to listen to her story, she was actually what they call SRA, satanic ritual abuse slave that was used for the elite's pleasure, and she named some names. So I encourage you to check out Fiona Barnett, and really powerful testimony. She speaks often about these things. So anyway, I say all that to get to where we're at now. Now, I hope I didn't drag this out too long, but I wanted to be thorough, because sometimes if it's something that people don't really understand or they've never heard of it, or especially when people have a preconceived position, so they already have made up in their minds something like they like a certain political party or not, or they don't understand what's going on, and they've developed a very conclusive position on these things. And so that's why I always tell people, you got to have an open mind. You got to listen, check my sources, do the research that I've done. I've done a whole lot of research on these things. This stuff is not new stuff. It's just new to some of us, right? So they've been doing this for a while. There's declassified governmental documents, there's books, there's talks, there's eyewitness reports of all the stuff that I'm talking about. So it's not a mystery. It's not something that didn't happen or may not have happened. These are definitely things that have happened. Operation Project Paperclip. Look it up. Declassified government documents that talk about how they got many of these Nazi scientists and brought them over here. Most of them went to like Columbia University. They use the educational system. So there's a lot of these colleges that are actually recruitment zones for these organizations. Harvard, Yale, Stanford University, I think University of Michigan, but there's several of them that's there that they actually use that to recruit many of the people that they're going to recruit into these organizations. And they always pick the best and the brightest to use them to manipulate the masses as a whole. So anyway, let's get back to what I originally started. Trauma-based mind control, especially in race. So they separate the races, which aren't a real thing. Race is a social construct that was created and developed by these people that we're talking about. It was Charles Darwin was one of these elitists or globalists, if you will, these Illuminati people. Galton, you had Malthus, you had, which is where, when we talk about the Malthusian dialectic, so he came up with a strategy in moving public opinion. It's all based on social engineering. So to move public opinion in a certain direction, you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Synthesis is the pre-packaged solution that they already have when they start the whole process. Just like the Vietnam War, there was a thing called the Gulf of Tonkin. It was what the government calls a false flag. So they staged an attack on a U.S. ship. They blamed it on the Vietnamese, and they used that to get the public to go to war in Vietnam. So they wanted to go to the war in Vietnam, and I'm going to tell you what, the war in Vietnam was primarily about the poppy seeds, and it was the bankers, the international bankers that have always exported drugs back and forth. So that's what Vietnam was about. They wanted to go in there. They wanted an excuse, so they had the Gulf of Tonkin. And so the people would say, yes, we got to go attack them because they attacked us. Many people speculate that, 9/11. Many people speculate that that was a false flag. And so they wanted to go in Iraq in the Middle East, and so they wanted public opinion. And if you look at the tapes after 9/11 happened, and they had these congressional hearings, almost every congressman, all the polls that they took, everybody said, let's go get them, let's go get them. Now, it's unfortunate that we were duped to the point where, even though they believed that Osama bin Laden was the one who orchestrated the plane attacks, and they believed that Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan, but we went to Iraq. So that goes to show you that there was a deeper strategy, a deeper conspiracy that was at hand. But anyway, those are things that you call false flags. Let me tell you some other things. The Ku Klux Klan was started. It's a type of a Masonic organization. Of course, it was started by the Democratic Party, but they used trauma in order to get people in the South to support the Ku Klux Klan, even those who may not have been racist. And what was that strategy? What was that fear they invoked? It was, they said that the black men, after what's called Reconstruction, after slavery was abolished, after the Emancipation Proclamation, they said you have these big black men that's going to steal our white women, the virtue of our white women. So they started the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. It was actually a military arm of the Democratic Party, formed by the Democratic Party in order to protect the virtue of the white woman. And so a lot of white people that may not have been racist, they went along with it because they provoked fear. They told them that these black men are coming to steal your beautiful blonde-haired daughters. And again, this is not me talking. This is what they did. There's a movie called Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith. If you get a chance to look at that, it goes into detail about it. It talks about the Reconstruction and how black people were in power. They said many of them took advantage of the power, and so the Ku Klux Klan came in because there's this famous scene in Birth of a Nation. I'll never forget it. I saw it when I was in college at a film class. This black soldier, this black Confederate soldier asked the white lady just for a kiss. I just want one little kiss. And she actually throws herself over a cliff because she said it was better for her to die and to protect her virtue and her honor than to have that black man touch her. And so that was the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. So that's the type of narratives that they use, the Hegelian dialectic. So they stir up these stories and then they go, okay, we have a solution here. You know, these false flags that they talk about. Charlottesville, I believe, was a false flag because the person who organized Charlottesville had been formerly an Obama supporter and a Democrat. He's registered as a Democrat and Obama supporter. So how do you go from supporting Obama and being a Democrat to immediately after the election of President Trump, now you're a white supremacist all of a sudden, right? A white supremacist wouldn't vote for Obama. Let's just put it that way. That just doesn't make sense. So it was all staged, and you had this big showdown, and there was a gentleman who lives in Charlottesville who reported and even showed some pictures of the white supremacists, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa getting off all in the same bus in the same staging area. But what happens is they provoke that, and what happens when I first started, I talked about how we have memory in our DNA and our genes, and so most of us black people have come from or descended from people that went through slavery and Jim Crow, so there was a lot of trauma during that time. And so what the enemy does is he provokes images to stir up that trauma inside of us, and it's easy to manipulate and control us. And not just during slavery and Jim Crow, but most of us as black people have had some type of experience where someone has mistreated you based on your color. There's racism, there's prejudice and biased people. It always has been. But if you go to a place that there's only one race of people, you have the same type of stuff. You have violence, murder, rapes, people not liking each other, people fighting. You always have that because that's part of the sin nature. But the reason that race is so easy to be a form of manipulation is because your very identity is tied into your skin color. You can't change your skin color. So if somebody identifies you to a certain class of people based on your skin color, and then they dehumanize you, that really cuts to the core, but it is the foundation of a type of trauma that they're using to get us to fight, to get us to hate each other. And they're doing that intentionally because they know that if they can keep us fighting white versus black, and it actually goes against the very desire that God has, because the Bible says that every tribe and every tongue and every nation will come together. The Bible never makes any differentiation based on skin color, ever, ever, ever. There's nowhere in the Bible that it talks about that. The Bible talks about nations and ethnicity, and it talks about behaviors. So the tribes that God told Israel to destroy, it was because they were satanically possessed. They were wicked people. They practiced all kind of abominable things. You had child sacrifice, pedophilia. You had all kind of crazy satanic stuff that they did, right? That's why God told them to destroy them, not because of their race. When God told Israel not to marry into certain tribes, it wasn't because of race. Now, they used that back in the days to say that interracial marriage was a sin or was an abomination. But God never differentiates because of skin color. As a matter of fact, in Acts 17, Paul says, out of one blood, he made every nation and every tribe and every tongue under heaven, right? So God created us all. There are differences in our physical appearance and in our culture, but that's not what God is condemning us or blessing us because of. So what the enemy's doing is he provokes that. The trauma, he constantly traumatizes us. He constantly shows things, and every time something happens and it's a black person and a white person, they invoke racism, racism, racism. See, this is racism. They did this to this group of people. It was racism. A person gets pulled over by a police officer. You're racist. You know, you made an assumption based on me. It's racist. Now, there are racist people in the world. I will never deny that I've experienced racism personally. But what I'm saying to you, it's as part of their strategy. So don't allow the enemy to have a place in your heart by falling victim to his schemes and his strategies. Like I said, when you try to operate and based on an emotional level, because the Bible says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, right? But also it says to us in the Bible that we should walk by faith and not by sight. Walk after the Spirit and not after the flesh. What does it mean by that? See, the flesh is where our emotions lie, our anger, our bitterness, our offense. You know, all these type of things are in our fleshly man, right? But you have a spirit man. So what God is saying, you need to be able to look at things from a spiritual perspective so that you don't fall victim to it. But even many Christians, we're looking at everything from a fleshly standpoint. And so it's always based on our anger and our emotions and our bitterness. So even when you inject actual facts and truth, this information and the research that I've gone through and I introduce to people, because people are so much in their flesh, they can't see these things from a spiritual perspective. So even forgiveness is something that's a spiritual endeavor. So people in their flesh, they can't forgive. Well, I can't forgive because do you know what they did to us? You know what they did with it, right? But you got to realize that forgiveness actually puts you in a place of authority over those people that have oppressed you. I'm going to say that again. When you forgive, you are not giving room in your heart for the bitterness, the anger, the offense, the pain, the hurt, the fear that the enemy wants to invoke in you, because the enemy uses those spiritual entities in order to oppress you and to keep you from moving into the fullness of what God has. The Bible says you got to sit in heavenly places. It means you got to look at things from a kingdom perspective. Look down from a kingdom perspective, not in your flesh. Don't look at what you see right now. Don't look at the fact that I had a neighbor across the street that was a racist, so I believe that there's racists. I saw a racist cop once before, so when I saw the thing with Mike Brown, I knew it was racism. You can't apply those things. You can't paint with such a broad stroke, because it's important for you to recognize that not every interaction between people of different races that are negative is based on race. There's sometimes that we give attitude to a cop and a cop mistreats us, or he oversteps his bounds. You know, there are a lot of cops that are like, we used to call them cowboys. I used to be in law enforcement years ago, and there was some people that were like cowboys. It didn't matter if the person was black or not. They wanted to be like the guys in the movie. They wanted to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis. The what they call it, the showdown at the OK Corral type of thing. Yeah, punk, you want a piece of me? You know, that kind of mindset. That's people that's already charged up all the time. They're just looking for somebody to give them attitude. And many times when our interactions with police, because we're assuming that they're coming after us from a racial standpoint, then we're already on amped up, right? Oh, what did he pull me over for? He's a racist. He's going to give me a hard time. What do you need to see my license and registration for? No, I'm not getting out of my car. You know, and I'm not making any type of, moral depiction on that particular instance. I'm just saying this is how it goes many times. So you got to witness and recognize what is going on here. The two things that they're using, again, I'm going to repeat this as I bring this to a close, is trauma-based mind control, which is used to manipulate the population through the media, through, the visuals that you see. They'll show you some racist person is saying something racist, and you say, look how much racism there is in the country. They use law enforcement. There's a lot of law enforcement that are part of these Masonic organizations. The Fraternal Order of Police is a type of Masonic organization. Not saying everybody's in on it, but there are people that they actually plan in those situations to stir up the controversy. You know, there are people that they actually use to stir up the controversy. There's some people that are in the KKK that are actually plants that they're getting planted in there to stir it up. Because a lot of times, if you notice it, if you listen to some of these people and look at some of the rallies, you know, as a black person, I've never been to one personally, obviously, but I've seen them. I've seen recordings of it. And sometimes I would say it seems like that stage, they're really over the top with that. And it's because they have a specific agenda that they're trying to push. They don't really concern that much with white and black situations. They're being told to stir up the masses, to stir up the anger, the bitterness, and the fear, because it's all based on fear, which is what the enemy uses. So what do they do in the KKK? They say the black people are going to overtake take all your stuff away from you. You're no longer going to be relevant because the colored people are coming to take over. Your daughters are going to go and they're going to marry one of these black kids. And so those are the type of fears they invoke in them. You know, with black people, they'll tell you, see, it's you know, Jim Crow and slavery all over again. Just like they did all of us, they're doing it to you now, and you got to fight it. If you don't fight, then something bad is going to happen to you. And, you know, from the beginning of history, you've always had people fighting each other. You've had people killing each other. 90% of the people in the world that get murdered by people of the same race as they are. So, you know, 90% of black people especially, but, you know, the vast majority of people in the world that get killed by somebody who looks like them. I mean, you know, the same ethnic background. So anyway, I just wanted your eyes to be open, because you got to understand the solution for all this stuff is what does the Bible say? So, you know, bless those who curse you, pray for those who despitefully use you. You got to forgive so that you can be forgiven. Don't give the devil place in your heart. You know, don't allow these things to take advantage of you. Look beyond the surface and don't allow these things to manipulate you based on your surface level emotional, you know, the base emotions, right? Fear and anger and hatred. Those are the low resonant frequencies that they get us to resonate in. And when you do that, nothing ever gets solved. You gotta begin to resonate from the higher frequencies of logic and spirituality and looking down the line. And of course, I'm a pastor, so I'm not suggesting any type of new age stuff or meditation. But if you meditate on the Word of God. If you pray in the Holy Spirit, right? He'll give you wisdom and understanding. Don't allow your flesh to get in the way and deceive you, and don't fall victim to the schemes of the enemy. The Bible tells us to know the devices of the enemy so that he does not gain the advantage over you. This has been Dr. Joe Green, and until next time, peace and blessings to you. Shalom, shalom.